The gentle hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin with a soothing rhythm, a background lullaby that had already put several passengers to sleep. Somewhere near the middle of the plane in row 12, a young woman sat by the window seat, her head resting lightly against the cool glass. The bright morning sun streamed in from above the clouds, casting a soft glow over her face. She was in a deep, peaceful sleep, the kind that only came after weeks of exhaustion. To the strangers around her, she was just another passenger, anonymous, unremarkable, and perfectly ordinary. The flight had been uneventful so far. Families flipped through magazines, business travelers typed furiously on laptops, and children pressed their noses against the small oval windows, pointing at the clouds below. Flight attendants moved gracefully up and down the aisles, serving drinks and snacks with practiced efficiency. Everything about the trip suggested routine. It was the kind of flight where nothing unexpected ever seemed to happen. But that illusion of calm was about to shatter. At first, it was just a small ripple of unease. A flight attendant hurried past row 12, her face unusually tense, her smile noticeably absent. A passenger in row 10 whispered to his wife that he thought he had heard something odd coming from the cockpit earlier, though she waved him off and told him to relax. Then came the faint chime of the overhead speaker, the kind of sound that usually preceded cheerful updates from the captain. People expected to hear the altitude, the temperature at their destination, maybe even a lighthearted joke. Instead, what they heard made the cabin fall into stunned silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice crackled, heavy with tension, "if there is a licensed pilot on board, please make yourself known immediately." Gasps erupted across the rows. Heads turned, conversations froze, and the atmosphere shifted from ordinary to surreal in an instant. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, their usual calm composure breaking ever so slightly. Some passengers looked around as if expecting someone to stand up right away, someone obvious, someone who looked the part of a professional pilot traveling off duty. But no one moved. The announcement echoed again, sharper this time, almost desperate. "This is the captain. If there is a pilot on board, please come to the front immediately." Panic began to spread. Whispers turned into frantic murmurs. Questions shot across the aisles. Why would the captain need another pilot? What was happening? Was the plane in danger? Mothers held their children tighter. Businessmen closed their laptops, and even the flight attendants seemed shaken as they struggled to maintain order. And through it all, row 12 remained eerily calm. The young woman continued to sleep, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of her dreams, entirely unaware of the chaos building around her. No one knew that within her rested a secret, one that could change the fate of every single passenger on that plane. As the tension grew, passengers speculated wildly. Some thought the co-pilot must have fallen ill, others feared mechanical failure. A few whispered about worst-case scenarios, their imaginations running rampant. The air felt heavier, tighter, as though the oxygen itself had grown scarce. A middle-aged man in a suit stood up hesitantly, raising his hand. "I'm not a pilot," he admitted nervously, "but I've logged hundreds of hours on flight simulators. I know how to—" "Please sit down, sir." A flight attendant cut him off firmly, her voice betraying the strain of the moment. "We need a licensed pilot." "Nothing less." The man sat, embarrassed, as more murmurs spread. Hope seemed fragile, almost non-existent. People glanced around desperately, searching for a savior among them. But all they saw were ordinary faces, tourists, families, professionals, and tired travelers, and there, nestled quietly against the window of row 12, the woman stirred slightly, shifting in her sleep but not waking. No one thought to look at her twice. To them, she was just a girl catching a nap, blissfully unaware of the storm about to break. Then the captain's voice came again, this time unfiltered urgency in his tone. "This is not a drill. We require a qualified pilot immediately. If you are trained to fly commercial aircraft, report to the cockpit now." The cabin erupted into chaos. A baby started crying. A man in row 8 demanded answers, his voice rising in anger and fear. A woman clutched her rosary beads and whispered a prayer. The crew moved quickly to calm the passengers, but it was clear that even they didn't fully understand what was happening behind the cockpit door. The hum of the engines no longer felt comforting. Instead, it sounded ominous, like a reminder of just how high above the earth they really were. The plane, which had seemed so solid and secure only moments ago, now felt like a fragile shell suspended in the vastness of the sky. Road 12 remained a strange island of peace in the storm. The young woman's hand slipped slightly, resting in her lap as her breathing deepened. For now she remained hidden in plain sight, her secret safe, until fate decided to wake her. Unbeknownst to everyone on that flight, the answer to the captain's desperate call was already on board. She just hadn't opened her eyes yet. The tension in the airplane cabin thickened like a storm cloud gathering weight. Every face reflected fear, confusion, or helplessness. The captain's desperate announcement lingered in the air, vibrating through the nervous whispers. A few passengers rose slightly from their seats, scanning the rows as though salvation might be seated among them. But no one stood. No confident figure walked down the aisle. No pilot revealed themselves. And then, in row 12, she stirred. The young woman blinked against the sunlight streaming through the window, stretching slightly as though waking from a pleasant nap. She rubbed her eyes, adjusting to the reality around her, and slowly became aware of the unease that had settled over the cabin. At first it was only the faint whisper of panic that reached her half-dreaming state, then the frantic rustle of passengers shifting in their seats, then the sharp cries of a baby in distress. Confused, she sat up straighter, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Around her, people were turned toward the aisle, craning their necks toward the front of the plane. Fear etched itself into their features. A man's voice carried from across the cabin. "What's going on? Why do they need another pilot?" She frowned, trying to make sense of it. Her seatmate, a young college student clutching his phone nervously, glanced at her and whispered, "You didn't hear? The captain just asked if there's a pilot on board. Twice." He sounded desperate. The words struck her like a jolt of electricity. Sleep fled instantly from her mind. She straightened, her eyes narrowing. "He asked for a pilot?" she repeated quietly, her voice low but sharp with meaning. The student nodded anxiously. "Yeah, people are freaking out. No one's standing up." Her heart began to pound, each beat hammering against her ribs. She glanced around, confirming what she already sensed. Panic rising, voices growing louder, no one volunteering, no one capable. She exhaled slowly, her mind snapping into sharp focus, years of training she had once tucked away reawakening like a dormant flame. The overhead speakers crackled again. The captain's voice, taut with urgency, filled the cabin. "This is the captain speaking. We have a medical emergency involving one of the pilots. I repeat, if there is a licensed pilot on board, please identify yourself to the crew immediately. Time is critical." Gasps rippled through the rows. A woman covered her mouth with her hands, eyes wide with terror. A man whispered, "Oh God. One of the pilots is down?" The cabin tipped toward hysteria, fear rising like floodwater with nowhere to escape. And there she sat, in row 12, her pulse steadying as her decision crystallized. For years she had left behind the cockpit. Walking away from the life she once thought would define her forever, she had traded uniforms for anonymity, control panels for quiet routine. But fate, it seemed, had a way of finding her no matter how far she ran. She rose quietly from her seat. The student beside her blinked in confusion. "Where are you going?" "To the front," she said simply, her voice carrying a certainty that startled him into silence. All eyes turned as she stepped into the aisle. Passengers watched, whispering, their hope suddenly alight. Could this ordinary-looking woman be the answer? Could she really be what they all prayed for? A flight attendant spotted her and hurried forward, her face a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Ma'am, are you?" "Yes," the woman interrupted, her tone firm but calm. "I'm a certified pilot. I need to see the captain immediately." The flight attendant's breath hitched. She gave a quick, urgent nod and motioned for her to follow. As they moved down the aisle, whispers erupted around them. "She's a pilot?" "Her, thank God. She doesn't even look like one." The woman ignored the voices. She had no time for doubt, no time for appearances. Every step toward the cockpit stripped away the veneer of simplicity she had worn for so long, revealing the truth she had kept hidden. The flight attendant stopped at the cockpit door, knocking twice in a coded rhythm. The door opened slightly and the tense face of the co-pilot appeared. Sweat clung to his forehead, his hands visibly shaking. His relief was immediate when he saw her. "Are you qualified?" he asked, his voice hoarse, almost pleading. She met his eyes steadily. "Type-rated on this aircraft model. Over 5,000 logged hours. Yes, I'm qualified. The door swung open wider and she stepped inside. The cockpit was a storm of blinking lights and tension. One of the pilots and the captain slumped unconscious in his seat, a flight attendant kneeling beside him, checking his pulse with trembling hands. The co-pilot sat rigid at the controls, sweat beading on his brow, his breathing shallow with panic. Relief flickered in his expression as she slipped into the cockpit. "I can't believe this." "You really—" "Yes," she said firmly, already scanning the instruments, her hands moving instinctively over the panels. "What's the situation?" The co-pilot rattled off the status: altitude, course, fuel levels, current weather. His words tumbled out, shaky but coherent. She absorbed them with practiced efficiency, her brain clicking back into a rhythm she thought she'd left behind forever. It was like slipping into a second skin, familiar, precise, and powerful. She glanced at the unconscious captain, then back at the co-pilot. "You did well keeping us steady," she reassured him, her voice steadying his nerves. "But you're not alone anymore. We'll get through this together." Behind her, the flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, trembling but hopeful. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have good news. A licensed pilot has stepped forward to assist in the cockpit. Please remain calm." The cabin erupted with gasps of relief. Some passengers cried, others clapped, while a few whispered prayers of gratitude. Row 12, once a picture of peace and anonymity, had become the center of salvation. Inside the cockpit, she buckled in, her hands steady on the controls. She felt the weight of 100 souls pressing down on her shoulders, but instead of fear, she felt clarity. This was where she belonged. This was what she was meant to do. "Let's get this bird home," she murmured, her voice carrying the quiet determination of someone who had faced storms before and prevailed. The engines roared beneath them, the sky stretched endlessly ahead, and for the first time since the announcement, hope filled the air. And yet, deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The cockpit hummed with life, each instrument flickering, each button glowing like the heartbeat of the massive machine suspended 30,000 feet above the earth. The young woman from row 12, no longer anonymous, sat firmly in the captain's seat. Her hands glided across the controls with instinctual precision, fingers brushing switches and knobs like an artist reacquainting herself with a forgotten canvas. For years she had distanced herself from this world, hiding her past behind ordinary routines. But the moment she touched the yoke, it was as though she had never left. The co-pilot, still rattled, stole quick glances at her. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his nerves betraying the weight of responsibility he had been forced to shoulder alone just moments earlier. Now, with her presence, he felt steadier but also awed. She didn't carry the appearance of a savior, yet her calm, steady voice filled the cramped cockpit with authority. "Stabilizers holding. We're at 32,000 feet, cruising speed Mach 078, she announced, her tone level professional. "Engine readings normal." "Autopilot engaged?" "Yes," the co-pilot confirmed, nodding quickly, "but I wasn't sure how long I could hold things together." She gave him a brief, encouraging glance. "You did what you had to. That's what flying is, and making the right call in the moment. Now let's make sure we bring everyone home safely." Her gaze shifted briefly to the unconscious captain slumped in his seat. A flight attendant was still beside him, pressing a handkerchief to his forehead, her lips moving in silent prayer. The woman from row 12, no longer merely a passenger, knew time was critical. A pilot incapacitated mid-flight was rare, but it was a scenario every trained aviator had rehearsed dozens of times in simulators. The difference now was that this wasn't a simulation. She pressed the radio switch. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 472. We have an incapacitated captain. Secondary pilot in command is present, requesting immediate vectoring for emergency landing. Nearest available runway capable of handling a 737. The static crackled before a calm voice replied, "Flight 472, this is air traffic control. Copy Mayday. Stand by, we're locating the nearest airport. Confirm you have 2 pilots in command?" She took a breath. "Affirmative. First officer and I are in control." The co-pilot gave her a side glance, a mix of disbelief and gratitude. She spoke with such authority as if she had never stepped away from this life. He wanted to ask who she was, why she had been sitting quietly in row 12 instead of in the cockpit from the start, but the moment demanded focus. Questions could wait. "Flight 472, copy that. We're routing you to Denver International. You'll have emergency clearance. Runway 34L will be ready. Expect descent instructions in 2 minutes." "Roger that," she replied crisply, releasing the switch. She leaned back slightly, exhaling through her nose, the weight of reality settling onto her shoulders. She had just committed herself fully, not just to the passengers but to the sky she had once walked away from. Behind the reinforced cockpit door, passengers buzzed with nervous anticipation. Word had already spread. A woman from row 12 had taken the controls. Some doubted, some hoped, and some clung to faith as the plane hurtled through the skies. The whispers carried through the cabin. Who is she? How does she know how to fly? Can she really save us? But up front there was no room for doubt. The co-pilot shifted uneasily in his seat. Listen, I don't mean to pry, but where did you train? You don't just sound like a hobbyist. Her eyes remained on the instruments, but her voice softened slightly. Naval aviation. Commercial conversion after? Years ago. His jaw tightened in surprise. Naval, you were military? Once, she admitted, fingers flicking over the throttle levers, testing their response. I left it behind. Life took me elsewhere. She paused, her tone firm again. But right now, that doesn't matter. What matters is keeping this plane steady, getting us on the ground in one piece. He nodded quickly, chastened but reassured. The intercom chimed, and a flight attendant's voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and calm. We are experiencing a situation, but everything is under control. A licensed pilot has taken over the cockpit. We are preparing for an emergency landing. Though the words were meant to soothe, panic still bubbled in the rows. A child asked his mother if the plane was going to fall. A man clutched his briefcase as though it could shield him from fate. Yet amid the chaos, some passengers exchanged hopeful looks. For the first time since the announcement, there was a glimmer of trust. Inside the cockpit, the woman's focus narrowed to the approaching task. Denver International loomed ahead, a massive hub capable of handling emergencies, but descending safely would not be easy. The weather radar displayed storm cells building near their approach path, jagged lines of turbulence waiting to test their control. Her jaw tightened. Fate had never made things easy. Prepare descent, she said calmly, hands gripping the yoke. Reduce throttle, flap set for initial. The co-pilot followed orders, his hand steadier now as her presence anchored him. The plane responded, nose dipping slightly, the horizon tilting as the altitude began to bleed away. The instruments beeped in protest, warning of changing conditions, but she adjusted with ease. Her body moved like muscle memory had been waiting for this moment. Every motion precise, every correction instinctive. Air traffic control returned. Flight 472, expect heavy crosswinds on approach. Storm front moving quickly. Do you require priority emergency vehicles on standby? Yes, she replied without hesitation. Notify medical. Captain is unconscious, possible cardiac event. Copy that. Emergency units will be standing by. The co-pilot glanced again at the unconscious man beside them, his chest rising shallowly. If we don't get him down soon. We will, she cut in, her tone brooking no doubt. Focus. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the rhythmic chatter of instruments and the clipped exchanges with ATC. Sweat beaded at the co-pilot's temple, but her expression remained calm, her breathing controlled. Inside, adrenaline surged, but she refused to let it surface. 100 lives depended on the illusion of unbreakable calm. As they descended, turbulence struck. The aircraft jolted violently, overhead compartments rattling, passengers gasping in terror. The co-pilot swore under his breath, gripping the yoke tighter. She steadied the plane with firm corrections, her voice unwavering. Stay with me. Anticipate the gusts, not react to them. The wind will push, but we control the bird, not the other way around. The co-pilot inhaled sharply, nodding as he mirrored her adjustments. Together, they leveled the craft, guiding it through the turbulence with the precision of a duet. In the cabin, fear rippled with every jolt, but hope clung stubbornly. Some passengers clasped hands across the aisle. Others whispered prayers. A teenager filmed quietly with his phone, capturing what might become history. Back in row 12, her empty seat stood as a silent testament to the extraordinary, a reminder that the quietest among them had carried the power to save them all. The descent continued, the ground creeping closer, the storm howling outside. The runway appeared ahead, lights glowing faintly through the shifting clouds. Denver sprawled like a promise of safety on the horizon. She tightened her grip. Final approach, she said, her voice steady but resolute. This is it. The co-pilot swallowed hard, aligning the plane with the runway. The storm roared, winds buffeting the massive machine. But she guided them true, her hands commanding the sky with the authority of experience. Every soul on board held their breath. And just as the wheels began to align with the runway lights, the plane shuddered violently, alarms shrieking across the cockpit. The storm wasn't finished with them yet. The plane groaned and shook as if the storm itself were testing the mettle of every person on board. The massive metal bird, suspended between heaven and earth, tilted and dipped under the erratic gusts of wind, challenging the skill of anyone daring to command it. Inside the cockpit, the young woman from row 12 remained unflinching, her eyes scanning instruments with the calm precision of someone who had faced far worse than turbulence in simulators, training sessions, and real-world missions. Every motion, every correction she made was deliberate, calculated to counter the erratic forces trying to wrest control from her hands. The co-pilot's knuckles were white as he gripped his yoke, his nerves still frayed from the earlier shock. He had watched her rise from obscurity in row 12, step into the cockpit, and assume command with a confidence that defied every assumption he had ever held about appearances. Now, in the midst of chaos, her authority radiated like a beacon. "We're losing stability on the right wing," he muttered, tension evident in his voice. She didn't flinch. "Counter with left aileron, apply slight rudder adjustment, keep nose steady. Don't fight the wind. Work with it." Her words were calm but absolute, each one a command shaped by experience and the unshakable certainty of someone who had lived 100 lives in the cockpit. The co-pilot obeyed, marveling at how effortlessly she translated complex aerodynamic physics into instinctive maneuvers. The plane jolted again, a violent roll that rattled instruments and passengers alike. Screams erupted from the cabin as children cried. Overhead bins rattled and oxygen masks swayed. Flight attendants clutched the rails, struggling to maintain composure, their training suddenly insufficient in the face of raw fear. Somewhere in row 12, the seat she had vacated stood empty, a silent reminder that the calmest person on the plane was now the one holding life in her hands. "Runway in sight," she announced, glancing at the window and then back at the instrument panel. The lights of Denver International pierced through the storm, a faint but tangible promise of safety. "Prepare for final descent. Gear down, flaps at 30 degrees. We touch in less than 2 minutes." The co-pilot followed orders, sweating but steadying as her authority anchored him. They were approaching at a higher than normal speed due to the gusting winds. Any miscalculation could send the plane skidding off the runway, but she was undeterred. Years of experience, countless hours in simulators, and a mind that calculated probability with the precision of a supercomputer had prepared her for this very moment. "Brace for turbulence at 500 feet, she said, her tone level. "Wind shear coming from the east. Hold the course." The plane lurched violently as a gust slammed the fuselage. Instruments beeped warnings, alarms shrieked, and the co-pilot's heart raced. But she maintained her focus. "Steady," she murmured. "Adjust pitch by 2 degrees. Keep thrust at 80%. Outside, passengers gripped armrests and prayed silently. Mothers whispered reassurances to their children, some unaware of how close to disaster they had come, others acutely conscious that their survival depended entirely on this woman's expertise. Every eye was drawn toward the cockpit, every whisper a prayer for the calm figure guiding the plane. The storm intensified as they descended further. The runway lights seemed to sway in the driving rain, creating a mirage that challenged even seasoned pilots, but she adjusted continuously, small corrections made instinctively, guiding the plane as though it were an extension of her own body. Visibility dropping rapidly, the co-pilot said, swallowing hard. I can barely see the runway." Her eyes didn't leave the instruments, her hands steady. "Trust the instruments. Focus on alignment, not illusion. Wind gusts are strong, but we can correct. Apply small rudder adjustments, not full deflection. Micro-corrections. That's how we stay alive." The plane descended, wings slicing through violent gusts. Rain hammered the fuselage. The tires, moments from touching the runway, felt the turbulence's pull, threatening to tip the aircraft. She pressed her lips together, guiding the yoke with a steady rhythm, calculating speed, angle, and wind vectors faster than the human eye could comprehend. Altitude 500, 400, 300. The co-pilot's voice trembled, repeating the numbers like a mantra to steady himself. "Gear check," she commanded. The lights confirmed, down and locked. Flaps extended. Everything was in place. She exhaled slightly, allowing herself a fraction of movement, but her mind remained razor-focused. The plane shuddered violently as the wind pushed against the right wing. The runway, previously a faint line of light, now expanded before them, a narrow target in a maelstrom. She adjusted pitch and thrust, whispering instructions to the co-pilot, whose hands mirrored hers in tense synchronization. Stay calm. Small corrections. Trust the plane. Trust me, she said, her voice soft but resolute. The engines roared as they descended further, finally aligning perfectly with the runway. She felt the vibration of the landing gear as it made initial contact, the tires gripping wet asphalt, the plane shuddering under uneven pressure. The co-pilot exhaled audibly, realizing they were alive, for the first time allowing himself a moment of relief. Reverse thrust. Brakes, she instructed, guiding the aircraft safely down the runway. Water sprayed in violent arcs from the tires as friction slowed the plane. Sweat ran down her face, but she maintained perfect control, managing the plane like a master conductor guiding an orchestra through a tempestuous symphony. The final few seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. A final jolt as the plane's nose wheel touched down, then gradual deceleration. They came to a complete stop, engines whining down, the storm still thrashing around them but no longer a threat. Silence filled the cockpit, the type of silence that carries disbelief, exhaustion, and relief all at once. The co-pilot finally allowed himself a shaky laugh. I can't believe we made it. She finally relaxed slightly, shoulders releasing tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding. We did, she said, voice calm but carrying the weight of what had just occurred. All of us. Over the intercom, the flight attendant's voice trembled with relief. Ladies and gentlemen, we have safely landed. Please remain seated until the crew instructs you to disembark. Emergency personnel are standing by and the captain is receiving medical attention. The cabin erupted with applause, tears, and quiet sobs. Some passengers hugged, others whispered thanks to the empty seats around them. And somewhere in row 12, people remembered the young woman who had been asleep moments ago. Completely unaware that she would soon be the heroine of the flight, she unbuckled, standing for the first time since the descent began, her hands still slightly trembling from exertion but her mind clear. She glanced at the co-pilot, who now looked at her with awe and gratitude. I never expected. You're amazing, he admitted. She shook her head, almost smiling. I didn't do it for praise. I did it because someone had to. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, relief and gratitude replaced fear. Emergency crews approached, and she stepped aside to allow them access to the captain and co-pilot. Passengers began to disembark slowly, still buzzing with stories of the miraculous landing, their admiration for the unknown woman who had saved them already becoming legend. And though everyone on that plane would remember her as a stranger who suddenly became their savior, she quietly slipped through the crowd, unassuming, almost invisible. Her role as a pilot, her brilliance, had once again been hidden behind simplicity, but today it had shone brightly enough to save dozens of lives. Even the co-pilot, seasoned and experienced, could only shake his head in disbelief. Row 12. She was asleep in row 12, and yet she saved us all. The cabin had quieted, but the echoes of fear and relief still lingered in the air like static electricity. Passengers remained seated, their faces pale from the adrenaline of the near disaster, eyes wide as they processed the fact that they had survived a potentially catastrophic event. The storm outside had not yet subsided, rain pounding the tarmac, but inside Denver International Airport's terminal, a different kind of storm was unfolding, one of whispered awe, gratitude, and disbelief. Emergency crews moved swiftly, tending to the captain, who was stabilized and taken to a nearby ambulance, and to the co-pilot who had performed admirably under pressure. Meanwhile, passengers were finally allowed to disembark, their steps tentative, some walking like people who had glimpsed mortality and returned. Cameras flashed, phones captured shaky videos, and murmurs of her heroism began circulating even before anyone knew her name. The young woman who had once simply been asleep in row 12 now found herself at the center of attention. Flight attendants approached her, eyes wide with reverence and curiosity. "Are you the pilot?" one asked tentatively, still unsure if this ordinary-looking woman could truly be the miracle worker they had witnessed. She nodded simply, her expression calm, almost humble. "I helped, that's all. But the landing. You another exclaimed. You saved everyone on board. She shook her head lightly, offering only a small, polite smile. We all played a part. The crew, the co-pilot, everyone stayed calm and followed procedure. I just guided the plane. Despite her modesty, word spread quickly. Journalists who had been waiting for passengers to exit rushed forward. Notebooks and microphones extended. Can you tell us what happened? One asked eagerly. How did you remain so calm? Her eyes, steady and unflinching, met the cameras. Experience and training, but also focus. Panic doesn't save anyone. Preparation does. She stepped back gracefully, as though the attention itself was almost uncomfortable. Yet she accepted it with poise. As news crews broadcast live footage, the passengers began telling their stories. Mothers hugged children tightly, thanking invisible hands for safety. Businessmen shook their heads in disbelief. The teen in the aisle filmed her discreetly, narrating breathlessly. She was asleep. Asleep in row 12. And then she saved us all. I don't even know her name, but she's our hero. Inside the airport, authorities and airline officials were already convening. A press release was being drafted and discussions of awards, commendations, and official recognition were underway. Airline executives spoke in hushed tones, awed that someone had remained incognito for so long, only to reveal unmatched skill at the most critical moment. The co-pilot, standing nearby, finally gathered the courage to speak. I've been flying for 15 years, he said quietly, almost to himself, and I've never seen anything like that. She knew what to do. Every move, every adjustment. It was perfect. She was calm, methodical, brilliant. I owe her my life. We all do. Passengers overheard and nodded, murmuring their agreement. Row 12. Once just a number in the cabin, now carried the weight of legend. People recalled the irony. The quiet woman asleep in the middle of the plane had become the linchpin of survival. The thought fascinated everyone. How easily appearances deceive, how heroism can reside behind the most ordinary facades. Eventually, airline officials approached her privately. We need your identification, one said, a hint of awe in his tone. Your licenses, your records, everything. We want to formally recognize your actions. She provided the documents without hesitation. Naval flight certifications, commercial licenses, thousands of logged hours. The evidence was irrefutable. The officials whispered among themselves, clearly astonished that someone who had seemed so ordinary could possess such extraordinary skill. Meanwhile, the media coverage exploded. Headlines blared across news channels and social media feeds. Row 12 hero unknown passenger saves flight. A sleeping woman becomes miracle pilot. Captain asks for help, savior found in middle of cabin. Passengers, journalists, and viewers alike were captivated by the story. Some called it unbelievable. Others saw it as inspiration, proof that courage and skill can appear in unexpected forms. But she remained humble. As cameras focused on her, she deflected praise. I was just doing my job, she said softly. Anyone trained properly would have acted the same. It's about staying calm, thinking clearly, and following procedure. That's what keeps people safe. Her anonymity had been stripped away, yet her demeanor suggested she preferred it that way. Recognition, accolades, and praise were secondary to her. What mattered was that everyone on the plane had survived, that the lives entrusted to her care had been protected. In the days that followed, the airline held a formal ceremony. Officials, passengers, and media gathered to honor the courage and skill that had saved countless lives. She received awards and commendations, applause ringing out in the hall, but her eyes remained modest, her posture unassuming. Journalists clamored for interviews, passengers wanted selfies, and social media buzzed endlessly with her story. Yet she insisted on staying in the background whenever possible, redirecting focus to the team, the crew, and the passengers' resilience. Passengers from row 12 were interviewed repeatedly. I remember her being asleep, one woman recalled, laughing nervously. We had no idea that quiet, ordinary woman would be the one to save us all. I'll never forget that. The co-pilot remained a steadfast supporter, often speaking on her behalf. People underestimate what they see, he told reporters. But training, skill, and experience can hide behind any face. Row 12, she proved that. She didn't need to shout or show off. She just acted, and we lived because of it. Over time, the story became more than just a news headline. It became a lesson a lesson in humility, preparedness, and the danger of assumptions. Schools discussed it, flight academies incorporated the incident into training, and passengers continued to recount their experience as one of the most harrowing yet miraculous events of their lives. And for the woman herself, life quietly returned to normal. She faded back into anonymity, preferring routine over notoriety. Yet she carried the memory of Row 12, of the plane trembling in the storm, and the moment when calm, focus, and skill had meant the difference between life and death. That experience, intense and overwhelming, remained etched in her mind forever, a quiet affirmation of why she had once devoted herself to the sky. Years later, passengers who had survived that flight would occasionally tell the story of the ordinary-seeming woman in Row 12, asleep moments before destiny called her, who rose calmly, guided the plane through chaos, and saved everyone on board. It became legend, a tale of courage hidden in plain sight. The captain recovered fully, the airline lauded the crew, and Denver International Airport kept a permanent record of the incident in its archives. Yet no plaque or ceremony could capture the essence of the woman who had turned near tragedy into triumph. She remained modest, quiet, and remarkably ordinary in appearance, Row 12's sleeper-turned-hero, the unassuming genius who revealed that sometimes the most extraordinary courage lies behind the simplest face, and so, while the storm outside had subsided, the story of Row 12 would forever remain vivid, a reminder that true heroism doesn't always announce itself, and the person who appears least likely may, in fact, hold the fate of many in their hands, the plane, the passengers, and the world had learned something unforgettable. Never underestimate the quiet, the ordinary, or the unnoticed, because sometimes the calmest sleeper is the one who saves us all.